My name is James, and I'm 25 years old. I'm writing this story because I can't keep it bottled up anymore, and there's no one I feel I can share it with. I'm really hoping that putting everything that happened to me down on paper will make things feel a little lighter. To be honest, my life hasn't turned out the way I pictured it. Then again, maybe that's because I never really pictured anything specific. I've always been content with what I had, just going with the flow. That's always been my normal. Growing up, I got used to being alone. My parents were always busy working, leaving me at home by myself. I learned to appreciate the quiet pretty quickly. Before long, silence became my closest companion. School was just another phase I had to get through. I wasn't the worst student, but I wasn't the best either, a pretty average kid in the middle of the pack. I had a few friends, but our relationships never went very deep. I've always found it hard to truly connect with people. It felt like I was living my life while everyone else was living theirs. After high school, I decided not to go to college. I went straight into work instead. At first, it was odd jobs, stocking shelves, working in warehouses, and then as a security guard at a parking lot. None of these jobs gave me any real satisfaction or a sense of moving forward, but that didn't bother me. As long as I could make enough to scrape by, I was okay. Since I turned 19, I've lived on my own in an apartment my grandmother left me. Floating through life without ambition seemed natural. While others built careers, started families, or pursued their dreams, I stayed exactly where I was. As for relationships, they never really worked out for me. I tried dating a few times, but every attempt ended in failure. Maybe it's because I never learned how to truly love or open up to someone. There's always been this invisible, but undeniable, gap between me and other people. They would come and go, but I always stayed behind. Over time, the loneliness and my difficulty connecting with others began to weigh on me. But I had a solution. Throughout my life, books had always been my escape. I could spend hours reading, immersing myself in stories that gave me a sense of meaning I couldn't find in my own life. Sometimes, it felt like books were the only thing keeping me afloat, giving me a way to momentarily escape reality. After a few years of inconsistent jobs, it didn't even surprise me when I got fired again. It happened suddenly but didn't hurt. I'd grown used to change and didn't hold on to any job too tightly. But unemployment started to gnaw at me as my savings dwindled. I spent a few months trying to find something new until a friend mentioned an opening for a cemetery caretaker. The idea unsettled me. Just the thought of working among graves gave me chills. I loved quiet, but cemetery quiet. That was a different story. Still, I couldn't say no. The pay was much better than anything I'd earned before. So, true to my nature, I decided to go with the flow and take the job without giving it much thought about what might come next. It was a Monday evening when I packed up and headed out for my first shift. When I arrived, the first thing I saw was the large, weathered gate at the entrance. On either side, a long, weed-covered fence stretched into the distance. Stepping through the gate, I found myself inside the grounds. To my right was a small caretaker's shack, and ahead of me, rows upon rows of graves stretched out, disappearing into the dim evening light of the setting sun. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in, before making my way toward the shack. It was September, and the days were growing shorter, which didn't thrill me. The work schedule was tight, night shifts every evening and occasional daytime shifts. The duties weren't too demanding, mostly involving 3 patrols per shift, an evening round at 10 p.m. to lock up the gates, a nighttime round around 3 a.m., and a morning round at 6 a.m. to reopen the cemetery. The pay, as I mentioned, was better than anything I'd earned before. The shack, despite its rundown exterior, turned out to be surprisingly cozy on the inside. But there was one thing that made me uneasy: the silence. As I expected, it was different here, heavier, pressing against my ears. Only the rustling of the trees and the occasional creak of the gate reminded me that I was still in the real world. Still, on that first night, I didn't dwell on it too much, because I wasn't alone. My mentor, Mr. Thompson, was the outgoing caretaker. He was an older man, hunched and solemn, with deep wrinkles etched into his face and a serious but slightly distant gaze. He looked like someone who had long since grown accustomed to a solitary existence among the graves. After a brief handshake and a few words of introduction, we headed out for the first patrol. It was 9:50 p.m., just 10 minutes before the cemetery gates were to be locked. Stepping out of the shack, Mr. Thompson shuffled over to the entrance gates, which groaned in protest as he pulled them shut. He wrapped a thick chain around the iron bars and secured it with a heavy padlock. After a few turns of the key, he limped back toward me. I waited near the first row of graves, holding the large flashlight he'd handed me. We walked through the cemetery as Mr. Thompson explained the routine: where to clean, when to patrol, how to handle paperwork for visitors. It all seemed straightforward and routine. The cemetery itself was well kept, with neatly trimmed grass, tidy grave enclosures, and clean asphalt paths. But one particular spot on the far edge of the grounds caught my attention. It was a large patch of land that had clearly been neglected for years. The tall, dry grass reached so high that the headstones were barely visible through it. Thick trees and sprawling bushes only added to the area's abandoned and eerie look. The whole section was cordoned off with red and white caution tape, the kind typically used at construction sites to warn of danger. "Don't go near that spot, and whatever you do, don't cross the tape," Mr. Thompson said abruptly, noticing my lingering gaze on the fenced-off area. His voice turned sharp, as if he wanted to end the conversation quickly. When I asked what was there, he just waved me off. "Just stay away. That's all you need to know," he said firmly and redirected our patrol elsewhere. The other patrols that night followed the same pattern as the first, walking the grounds, shining the flashlight around, checking for visitors, drunks, or troublemakers. 2 laps later, we were back at the shack. The next morning, I returned home with an uneasy feeling. Mr. Thompson, who seemed to know every inch of the cemetery, was hiding something. He refused to explain what was so significant about that fenced-off area, shutting down the topic entirely. My curiosity began to grow. What made that place so off-limits? Over the next few shifts, we worked together. Mr. Thompson shared tips about the job and offered advice, but whenever we neared that part of the cemetery, he grew silent and somber. His eyes would nervously flick toward the area, but he never said a word about it. I usually try to mind my own business, but this time, something felt off. This cemetery, which was supposed to be just a routine job, seemed to hold a deeper mystery. Especially in those moments when I caught the strange expression on Mr. Thompson's face whenever we were near the restricted zone. Eventually, I started to understand that area wasn't fenced off without reason. Something had happened there. Something Mr. Thompson didn't want to talk about. But I wasn't sure how long I could keep my curiosity in check. What was he hiding? And what made that place so dreadful that it couldn't even be discussed? Time went on, and Mr. Thompson passed all his knowledge on to me. Soon, I was the one patrolling the cemetery alone. The nights were quiet, the scheduled patrols uneventful, and I quickly settled into the rhythm of this unusual profession. I moved some of my belongings into the shack, including a small, outdated TV and, of course, my books. The longer I worked there, the more I noticed a pattern. Visitors who came to pay respects to their loved ones never went near the fenced-off section. One day, I couldn't help myself and asked a regular visitor about the area. Once again, I got no answer. Repeating the question to a few others yielded the same result. Eventually, I stopped asking, but my curiosity only grew stronger. The following night, during my second patrol, I saw something strange. That night was unusually still. No wind, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence. For the first time, I felt a deep unease I couldn't explain. As I swept my flashlight beam across the graves, I approached the western part of the cemetery, where the fenced-off area lay. The closer I got, the more nervous I became. Suddenly, in the beam of my flashlight, a shadow flickered, tall, unmistakably human. I wanted to chalk it up to a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by one of the gravestones. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. 100 steps further, I heard a rustling sound near a nearby headstone. When I approached and looked behind the stone, there was nothing there. Instead, I found myself standing directly in front of the fenced-off area. That's when I heard it, a whisper. Low and chilling, coming from somewhere deep within that forbidden zone. Abandoning my patrol, I bolted back to the shack and stayed there until morning. Everything might have been fine if similar unsettling events hadn't started happening every night. As much as I wanted to blame it on fatigue or an overactive imagination, the experiences were becoming too vivid to dismiss. There was only one rule I followed without fail: never cross the tape and never step foot into the fenced-off area. A week passed. Occasionally, I would ask regular visitors about the western part of the cemetery, but all I ever got in return were somber looks and silence. One evening, there was a knock at the shack's door. It was Mr. Thompson. I was genuinely happy to see the old man, as it had been a long time since we'd last spoken. "I hear you've been asking the locals about the abandoned section. Is that true?" he asked. "Yes," I admitted. "Strange things have been happening in that part of the cemetery. I don't know if it's just my imagination or something more sinister." The old man gave me a grim look and motioned toward the door, silently asking me to follow. We stepped outside, circled around the shack, and came to its backside. Next to the wall was a small annex that led to a basement. Strangely, I'd never gone around the building before and hadn't even known about the additional structure. The former caretaker opened the unlocked door and led me down. Darkness and dampness wrapped around us like a heavy cloak, and I felt my heartbeat quicken. At the bottom of the stairs was another door, labeled Archives. Thompson warned me what I was about to learn would change everything. We crossed the threshold and entered a large room. The space was far larger than the shack above. Rows of cabinets filled the room, their shelves stacked with aged documents, yellowed by time. The air was thick with the unpleasant smell of mold and dampness. The dim light from a single bulb cast strange shadows on the walls. "This is her case," Thompson said quietly, pulling a tattered folder from a pile of papers. The cover bore a single name that sent a chill down my spine. He opened the folder and began explaining, showing me old photos, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. Her name was Evangeline. Years ago, there was a woman accused of murdering her own child. People claimed it was a ritual killing, that she'd gone mad or fallen under the influence of dark forces. Rumors spread that the child had been sacrificed and that Evangeline gained unimaginable power, even forming a pact with the devil. No one knew for sure, but the fact of the murder remained undeniable. There was no trial. Instead, a mob gathered one night and decided her fate themselves. The old caretaker paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. I stared at the ancient records, my heart heavy with dread. They buried her alive, in secret. She was interred in that section of the cemetery, the one now considered cursed. That's why people avoid it. Her spirit found no peace and continues to haunt anyone who ventures too close. Thompson's gaze was steady, reflecting in the dim light of the archive. Evangeline's curse affects anyone who steps onto the ground where she was buried, as well as those who learn of her story. Anyone who disturbs her rest is doomed. His words weighed heavily on me. This wasn't just an old cemetery with local legends, it was something much darker. And now, I was part of it. The strange occurrences I'd been experiencing were undoubtedly tied to this story. After my conversation with Thompson, I couldn't find peace. My mind refused to accept the truth I'd learned in the archive. If it were just some old myth meant to scare newcomers, I could have laughed it off and gone on with my work. But something had shifted. I began to feel her presence, Evangeline's presence. At night, I started having terrible dreams. In them, I saw her face. Where her eyes should have been, there were only dark hollows, yet I knew her gaze was fixed on me. She stood by my bed, silent, but that silence was the most terrifying thing I'd ever experienced. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, unable to distinguish dream from reality. During my patrols, I began to see her silhouette among the old graves. She was watching me. Every day, an elderly woman named Mrs. Green would sit near one of the graves close to the cursed section. I saw her almost every time I made my rounds. One evening, as I took an unscheduled walk, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows between the gravestones. My thoughts were consumed by the events of recent days, the shadows, the dreams, and the woman. As I passed Mrs. Green, I noticed her slowly lift her head and motion for me to come closer. I hesitated at first but decided to approach. Her eyes studied me intently as I drew nearer. When I stopped in front of her, she began to speak in a whisper. "You see her too, don't you?" she asked, her gaze piercing mine. The question caught me off guard, and I simply nodded. We both knew what she meant. "She'll keep haunting you," Mrs. Green continued. "She'll visit your dreams, stay close, and she won't stop until you do what must be done." The old woman averted her eyes, staring down at the ground. Still looking at her feet, she went on. "Her soul hasn't found peace. Evangeline's curse is still active, and anyone who learns the truth about her story can't escape it. She haunts those who know." Mrs. Green's face remained calm, but her words grew darker and more resigned. Her hollow eyes held an unmistakable sorrow and hopelessness, as if she'd long accepted her fear. "She must be reburied," Mrs. Green said. "Her spirit won't rest until her body is laid to rest properly. But it's not that simple. Her ghost drives anyone who knows about her to madness. Even in death, she's claimed countless souls." The old woman sighed heavily, her tired eyes locking onto mine. "She haunts me too. I've come to terms with it. I'm old. Nothing scares me anymore. But you're young. You still have a choice. Just remember, if you decide to rebury her, there's no turning back." Mrs. Green's words had made my already unbearable existence even harder. Now, I wasn't just haunted by Evangeline's presence, I was shackled by the weight of an unmade decision. I could either continue living as I was, enduring her relentless torment, or take the leap and attempt to rebury her, consequences be damned. The first option meant resigning myself to a life of perpetual fear. Each night brought worse nightmares, and every shift at the cemetery felt like a battle for survival. Apparitions flitted between gravestones, eerie sounds echoed around the caretaker's shack, and ominous shadows tapped on the windows. It was becoming too much to bear. The second option, though terrifying, offered a glimmer of hope. If I succeeded in reburial, the curse might finally lift, and I could reclaim my life. But what if I failed? The thought of unleashing something even darker paralyzed me. After that conversation with Mrs. Green, I began researching Evangeline's story more deeply. The archive became my sanctuary as I pored over old records, piecing together her tragic history. Locals, once silent, started sharing their accounts when they realized I too was haunted by her. They spoke in hushed tones, revealing what little they knew of the cursed graveyard's past. It took me a month to prepare for the ritual. I meticulously documented every step in my journal to ensure I wouldn't forget anything. I gathered tools and scouted the cemetery's eastern section for a new burial site. The spot I chose felt right, far from the cursed area, beneath the open sky. The ritual required strict adherence to ancient rules. Among them, a witness was deemed essential, a priest to oversee and sanctify the process. I visited countless churches, seeking someone brave enough to help. But each time, I was met with refusals. The weight of Evangeline's curse had silenced them all. Desperate and out of time, I decided to go it alone. Evangeline's hauntings had grown unbearable, leaving me no choice. I resolved to be meticulous, double-checking every detail, knowing that even a small mistake could prove disastrous. The night was unnaturally quiet. A faint breeze rustled the skeletal branches of the old trees, their shadows dancing across the uneven ground. The air was cold, biting at my skin as I stood before her grave, the name Evangeline faintly etched into the weathered headstone. At my feet lay a shovel, its blade gleaming faintly in the moonlight. I glanced at my watch, just past sunset, the twilight hour when the veil between the worlds of the living and the dead was thinnest. Taking a deep breath, I grasped the shovel and began digging. Each thrust into the earth felt heavier than the last. As soil piled around me, the quiet seemed to deepen, pressing against my ears. Occasionally, faint whispers brushed against my senses, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. The air thickened, as though the night itself were holding its breath. After nearly an hour of relentless effort, the shovel struck wood with a dull thud. I cleared away the remaining dirt, revealing the coffin's rotting lid. Carefully, I climbed into the grave, sweat trickling down my face despite the chill. Using lengths of rope, I secured the coffin's corners and looped the other ends around sturdy nearby tree trunks. One by one, I tightened the ropes, hauling the ancient casket inch by inch out of its resting place. My muscles screamed in protest, but I pressed on, driven by desperation and adrenaline. Finally, the coffin emerged from the ground, its surface splintered and warped by decades of decay. Sitting beside it, I caught my breath, my body trembling from exertion and fear. I avoided looking directly at the casket, unable to shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching me. Taking a crowbar, I pried open the lid. The nails groaned in protest before giving way. When the lid finally slid off, I froze. Evangeline's body lay inside, eerily preserved, her face frozen in an expression that sent a chill through my very soul. I worked mechanically, my mind a fog of terror and determination. Lifting her body, I placed it in a new coffin waiting nearby, its polished surface stark against the grim surroundings. She was impossibly light, as though she were more shadow than flesh. Carrying her across the graveyard felt like traversing an eternity. Every step was accompanied by the oppressive sensation of being watched. The open grave awaited, and I carefully lowered the new casket into its depths. Standing over it, I began reciting prayers I had written in my journal. My voice sounded foreign, hollow, as though someone else were speaking through me. The words echoed strangely in the still night. Something felt wrong. The air seemed to vibrate with an unseen tension, and an inexplicable unease prickled my skin. Still, I pressed on, sealing the casket and beginning to fill the grave with dirt. With each shovelful, the whispers around me grew louder, no longer faint but insistent. When the grave was finally filled, I collapsed to the ground, wiping cold sweat from my brow. The ritual was over. But as I sat there in the silence, dread began to creep over me. I had performed the ritual alone, without a witness to guide or validate my actions. I clung to the hope that my diligence would suffice, that my oversight wouldn't doom me. But deep down, I knew the truth: I had made a grave mistake. The week following the ritual turned into a nightmare beyond my worst fears. I had quit my job, but Evangeline did not quit me. Her shadowy figure appeared in mirrors, her silhouette lingered behind my windows, and countless other terrors plagued me, too horrifying to put into words. My life devolved into a fragile attempt to cling to my sanity. Every night, I woke gasping for air, crushed under the weight of her mangled body pressing against my chest. It was suffocating, the pressure making it hard to breathe. And now, she wasn't confined to reflections. She began appearing in broad daylight, no longer limited to mirrors or other surfaces that acted as bridges between realms. One evening, her presence became almost corporeal. I felt a cold, damp hand grip my shoulder. The room filled with the stench of damp earth and decay. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew heavy, clinging to my skin like a shroud. A bone-deep chill spread through me, raising goosebumps across my body. In that moment, the boundaries separating the world of the living from the dead crumbled. I could no longer distinguish reality from delusion. Was I truly experiencing this, or had my mind surrendered to madness? Guilt gnawed at me, an unrelenting force that hollowed me out from the inside. My reflection was no longer my own. When I looked into the mirror, I saw a stranger, sunken eyes, pallid skin stretched tightly over protruding bones, and movements that felt foreign and clumsy. Sleep eluded me entirely. Nights became an endurance test, staring into the darkness, waiting for her to come. Unable to bear it any longer, I returned to the cemetery, desperate for answers. I hoped to find Mrs. Green. She sat in her usual spot, gazing at the ground with the same stoic expression. In our brief conversation, I confirmed my worst fear: the presence of a witness had been an absolute requirement. My arrogance, thinking I could do it alone, had doomed me. I followed the steps, I told her, my voice trembling, everything but that one part. I thought it wouldn't matter. She shook her head slowly, her face a mask of pity. That one part, she said, her voice heavy with finality, was everything. Now, I live alone. I have no job, no books to distract me, and I am too afraid to sleep. In every shadowed corner, she watches me. I don't know how much longer I can endure this existence. The crushing weight of guilt and the knowledge that nothing can be undone consumes me. At this very moment, I sit at my desk, finishing this account as twilight descends. To my left, a vanity mirror whispers her name. Behind me, the dark hallway door waits, where soon, someone, or something, will knock. Whether it is Evangeline or my unraveling sanity, I no longer know.